My name is Genji, and I'm a PhD student at Imperial College London. So today's event is hosted by the collaboration between Consciousness Club Tokyo, which is organized by Hiro Hamada from ARIA, and also Consciousness Talks, which is organized by Naoto Chia. And today we have two great speakers, Dr. Nori Jacoby and Dr. Masafumi Oizumi, who are going to give us talks related to large language model and consciousness. And so here is today's schedule. So we will first have talk from Dr. Jacoby, and then we will have a short Q&A session. And after that, we will have talk by Dr. Oizumi and another Q&A session. And finally, we have like general Q&A or discussion until up to like 7 p.m. in Japan time. Okay. And so the first speaker is Dr. Nori Jacoby, who is a research group director at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics, where he directs the computational auditory perception group. And he is joining Cornell University as an assistant professor next year. And Dr. Jacoby uses machine learning techniques in large-scale behavior experiments to study internal representation that supports sensory and cognitive abilities. And I'm particularly passionate by his recent research that uses large language models such as GPT-4 for understanding sensory experiences, which I think he is going to touch on in his today's talk. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Jacoby and enjoy the talk.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for considering this invitation. I'm really interested and excited for this interesting interaction. Let me share the screen. And I want to say that I changed a little bit the topics of my talk to reflect the broader question at stake. So not only large language models, but language in general. And in consciousness, I'm particularly interested in the question of internal representation and experience in perception. So that's going to be the topics of today. So when we sense something, our minds necessarily creates an internal representation that summarizes important sensory information, giving us the sense of experience, but also supports first decision making and action. When we do that, what is right in front of us is strongly influenced by previous experience. So perceptual priors and concepts and categories that we experienced from the past strongly influence what we see here and now. Importantly, language both allow us to actually form concepts and for things that we have not directly experienced in our senses, but also have strong influence on our internal representations. And that is very important to understand perception. We have to understand what is the contribution of semantics and language. So in my work, tries to characterize internal representations, and then I'm very interested in understanding the role of experience in perception. And then I'm interested about the relation between priors and language. And more recently, and that's kind of where we are meeting today, alignment of machine learning and neural representation in terms of their internal representations. So today I'll talk about 5 short vignettes from my work. First of all, I will start with a question about categorical perception and language. Then I'll talk about how much of the perceptual word can be recovered from language. That will be part 2. And part 3 would be the question about humans and machines. Do they form similar priors, similar perceptual representations? And then I'll ask about how much perceptual information can be recovered from words. And finally, I talk about some preliminary results related to the question of how language affects internal representations. So I'll start with part 1. So it's a classical question, the importance of a language informing new concepts and new categories in perception. But if you try to research these questions, one of the limitations is that you basically need a method to characterize internal representation in priors that relies as little as possible on language. So we have several techniques that we developed in the time or use in order to answer this question, but I want to present you one that I think is interesting and new. So it's serial reproduction. And serial reproduction, we all know what serial reproduction is similar to the game of telephone. One person says a word, whispers to another person, that person whispers to another person, and so on. And the fun in the game is that even if you start with a really obscure word, you end up with a banal word, because every time there's a chance that the person will not report what they actually heard, but what they think they heard. So there's a chain progressive, things become more and more expected. And Tom Griffith and his group found that this classical old game can be used to probe perceptual priors. The idea here that there's a principal distribution between the playing the game a lot of times and looking at the distribution and the mental perceptual priors in this case on words in the social context. And the idea is that because people are more driven to their expectation, there's going to be a mathematical link between this expectation and mental representations. So this is really interesting tool to understand internal representation, and I've been using the series of studies. And I'll talk about today about one that has a cultural aspect and is related to musical rhythm. So why musical rhythm? Mainly because it's nonverbal. It's a very interesting domain because musicians may have words or vocabulary to describe that in different cultures, but typically non-musicians, even though our participants, they feel the rhythm, they like the rhythm, they engage with it, but they cannot have a very detailed vocabulary to describe it. So how do we elicit their mental representation without words? So we use a serial reproduction. Participants are either replicating from memory or synchronizing with the rhythm, something like that. And what we do is we take the reproduction becomes the stimulus for a new iteration. So they basically playing game of telephone with themselves. And then we take this and follow up. And just like the game of telephone, things becomes more and more expectant, so you can reveal their expectation basically by running this experiment multiple times. So we study simple perceptual space that we can combinatorically exhaustively search. This is space of simple rhythm, something like this, 300 rhythm. And the details are not important. What's important here that this entire perceptual space engulfs some of the simple rhythms that are found in Western music, the ones that can be notated in Western musical notation with simple integer ratios, but also other rhythms that are that don't have integer ratio durations. So in the experiment, we start with uniformly sampling from this mental space, from the notorical space. And then the results of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 iterations of participants show particular beautiful clusters in particular location. Then we form kernel density over the 5th and final iteration, and I show you the results. And this is empirical data, just response of the participants after the procedure. But what you see is clearly these categories, very, very strong hotspots in the distribution. And these hotspots beautifully overlap with Western categories, integer ratios categories. And so the categories that are very common in Western music are appearing there, but there's a nuanced, complicated shape and distribution of categories that we can reveal from the participants' minds without asking them to use any single word. So the next step was to run this in 39 groups in 15 countries with almost 1,000 participants. This is not mainly online experiments. There are some online experiments, but most of it is face-to-face session, some of them in small-scale societies. We get a lot of triangles. And importantly, in every single triangle, we are seeing these hotspots. So categorical perception seems to be universally present, even in that for many of our participants, this is nonverbal, and we don't have very precise words to describe it. Importantly, this integer ratio categories overlap. So a lot of them are integer ratio, not all of them, but most of them are simply integer ratios. But interestingly, there's a lot of cross-cultural variability. So just like colors, we're seeing different in different cultures, different categorical mental representations. And what it seems to explain the variability is musical structure. So rhythms that have cultures that have 332 in different geographic location, languages, and so on, seems to or leads to prominent 332 in the triangles that we see in the experiment. And however, what doesn't seem to play a role at all is language. So we can have cases where people speak very different languages and show similar priors, or cases where people speak the same language, even from the same city, but have very different distributions. And if you try to understand why they have these distributions, again, it's their listening habits. So the music that they listen is different, and this explains the variability in the results. So to summarize part one, serial reproduction is an efficient way to characterize mental representation. Musical rhythms have complex categorical structures across culture, but being mostly nonverbal. And the category seems to be, at least in our experiment, independent from language. So that's vignette one, and now vignette two. How much of the perceptual word can be recovered from language? Again, this is a very classical question. So here, we use 3 data sets from 3 different modalities in the work published in ICLR. And it's audio, vision, and images. And for each of these, we looked at pairs of stimuli, and we computed similarity methods. Very familiar to you guys. All right. Now, to understand the language, we did what machine learning typically doing. We collected caption data for these images, or tags, which are basically tag word annotations. We did it in a special paradigm, but it doesn't matter for right now. Just to show you that those tags are high quality. So for example, this is for audition, emotional prosody, so the emotional people speaking in an emotional way. And we can recover just from the data, the beautiful arousal, when we map it into a dimension reduction algorithm, we get this arousal valence dichotomy that is familiar from the literature, and it's a very rich taxonomy of emotional terms, even though we not pre-specify one of these terms a priori. Okay, so what we do, we take these textual descriptions or tags, we feed them to a large language model, and then we look at typically the last layer of large language model, and you use it as a representation, computing the similarity metrics. We take these images, we feed it them either, so what I said, make humans or machines, but typically humans create the caption and tags, feed them into the large language model, or we take the sensory image directly into a DNN that it's the sensory images, or we compute it to the ground truth, which is the human similarity directly with images. And we can also stack the DNN representation and LLM representation, creating a longer vector, and compute the similarity metrics. And now what is predictive of the ground truth human alignment? What we found is that the LLMs representation that eats the text and didn't have direct access to the image were very, very good. In fact, they typically beat the DNNs that have direct sensory access to the image. And it's not that DNN were bad, but they didn't get an advantage by exposed to the actual image. So basically, most of the similarity structures in those data sets were captured by the semantic information when we downgrade it into or pass it through the LLM. Interestingly, when we combine the sensory experience from the DNN and stacked representation and the LLM, we get slight improvements, suggested that the sensory information provides some additive value in terms of predictive power compared with the semantics alone. So to summarize this part, works to cover a significant amount of sensory structures in these domains, and sensory information provides an additional additive contribution to predicting human sensory similarity judgment. And we've now extended it to other modalities. It doesn't seem to be very specific to these particular modalities, also more abstract domains. Okay, so part 3 is, do humans and machines form similar perceptual priors? And it touches also a different question. So we often write in our grants, well, why we'll study cognitive science? And well, one of the benefits down the road would be that we'll inspire from human architecture, we'll develop new computer algorithms. And these will be inspired by human brain, and maybe they're better aligned with humans, or they're just better. So we want to test that, and whether computer architecture that are similar to human leads to more human alignment. So in this paper, we developed a method to perform, again, serial reproduction, so telephone game. And this time we've seen we presented people an image and a dot that is located on top of the image. Then we take the image and the dot, and we bring back the image and ask participants to replicate by clicking the location of the saved dot. Now we take this and bring it to another participant of the same participants. The location is the location for the previous iteration. And we continue this multiple times, just like I explained about serial reproduction, and then converge after a few iterations. So initially it starts with a uniform random distribution, and after about 20 iterations, we get those nice categories. These are kind of the priors given the image of this mental representation. And if you run it for geometrical shapes, you see something very interesting. The attractors and anchors of this attentional kind of memory anchors, that are the anchors, because basically people can reconstruct the rest of the image from looking at these shapes. And we can also do it for natural shapes, natural images, and we get these beautiful maps for different natural images. And then we compute it for about 25 images. Importantly, in the same images, we also collected or used data about eye tracking, about discrimination ability of spatial location of dots, and about explicit reports of importance in the image. So these are typical kind of under attention, something around attention. These are tasks that's supposed to measure attention. And we wanted to see if there's an overlap. And when we found it across the 6 tasks, including our own task, we collected most of this data anyhow. We found that there was a very similar repeated structure along the image, suggesting that there's a shared component, this PC component, that characterize a lot of the shared variability between those different human tasks, even though they're very different nature in reality. Now we tested whether computer algorithm have this structure. So we tested deep neural network, feed-forward deep neural network, and use interpretability techniques to see where they are looking at. And we get those map of attention. And interestingly, we also compared architectures that explicitly use visual attention. So you know that machine learning algorithms are now using often kind of attentional maps to direct their gaze into the interesting areas. And this is improving performance for sure. And this is why they adapted in many cases. But the question is whether these attentional maps inside the algorithm are aligned with human attention as explicated in this shared component. So what we found is that simple DNNs are highly predictive of the human shared component, and they have high correlation. But this attentional maps from the deep learning algorithm are not more predictive. They are actually less predictive comparing with the simple deep neural network. And so to summarize, the performance of deep learning algorithm is not tightly connected with human alignment, and inspiration from human cognitive mechanisms in machine learning does not necessarily increase human alignment. So adding this attentional mechanism doesn't really lead to a better alignment. Okay, next vignette is how much perceptual information can be recovered from words. So again, this will be familiar to you. We can use similarity judgments by human, and you can do some kind of dimension reduction. This is a classical work by Shepard, and then we recovered some kind of mental representation, in this case, the color wheel. And this is, of course, familiar for you with slightly different techniques in your work. But this is not particularly unique to colors. For example, this is a famous pitch representation, which pitch frequency, taking together both pitch height and chroma, octave equivalence, leads to this beautiful classical helical representation by Shepard for pitch, which pitches that are separated by octave are positioned in the position that are similar in the helix. Okay, so how can we elicit it from GPT? We can create a prompt. In the prompt, we put the hex code of the color or the frequency of the pitch and so on. And we ask them to perform explicit similarity judgment. And we can do it in all of these modalities with hex code in colors, frequencies in pitch, loudness in dB, and vocal consonant in the IPA notations. And we can also use timbre and taste. This is more indirectly using words. What we see is that the performance of GPT-4 is pretty good in all the modalities, even though it varies from modality to modality. And the representation we get is consistent with your expectation. For example, for colors, we get this simple color wheel. This is very limited color sets, the typical classical ones. But we can also see that explicitly we can ask GPT to provide explanation to what they did, and then they mention color wheel and color spectrum. So this is the explanation. And this is the word cloud of their explanation. So basically, they're explicitly aware to the representation. In pitch, we get in human data, we get this frequency fall, and we get a peak in the octave equivalence, in the octave. So we get a representation that have a pitch distance and an octave equivalence, just like we predict from the helix. GPT reconstruct this representation. And when we look at the MDS space that generate, we reconstruct this pitch helix by Shepard, the classical pitch helix by Shepard from the GPT data. In vocal consonants, similarly, we construct manner, and again, GPT explicitly mentioned manners types, and in the vocal, we see it in the data in the MDS. Importantly, for our talk here, there's two important things. First of all, it's not about data leakage, because the two data sets here, pitch and consonants, are data sets that we explicitly collected ourselves, so they don't exist explicitly in the literature. The other thing is that GPT-4 is the only one who had access to visual information. So it has access to visual information, and it was indeed a little bit better in colors, but it was also better in pitch, where it didn't have direct access to the sensory information. So this suggests that the LLM predicts sensory information, but the access to visual information is not likely to be the source of increased alignment in GPT-4, but just better performance. And we're testing in the larger zoo of models that allows us to test it quantitatively in other models that have or not having access to the visual modality or to auditory modality now. Finally, I want to mention a classical question, which is going to be about how language affects internal representations. So we all familiar with the classical Berlin and Kay work on the World Colors Survey, which they presented colors to participants and asked them to name them. And they found significant differences across colors in terms of naming. Some cultures have just a very few colored names, and other cultures have a lot of color names. And by color names, I mean colors that a lot of people are using. There's a huge vocabulary for words describing colors, but most of them are not used very often by participants. So the basic color is the one that are used, and the basic color, number of basic color varies from culture to culture. And it has influence on perception. So downstream work showed that it actually also influenced perceptual sensitivity. So for example, one contrast, in English, we have two words of blue, but in Russian, Hebrew, a Hebrew speaker, and in Greek, and also in Italian, we have typically more than two. There are two words. I think in Japanese too, but that's too complicated for me here, right, to talk about this right now. Okay, so what we can do, we can present colors to participants, and we can present color to GPT. And this is some preliminary results. And here we're still collecting data here. So this is human and human participants. And what you see here is that this is online experience, and replicated the famous distinction in that human participants have this blue in English, one blue, but in Russian, we have two kind of blue. You see that, interestingly, some English participants use another term, turquoise, for some of the colors, and in Russian, it's even bigger. But interestingly, in GPT-3, we see replication of this cutting of this color, blue categories into two categories, but the turquoise categories that are much larger in the GPT representation. And in general, GPT is much more refined representation compared with humans, and we'll see it in a bit. So the next step was to collect this in 35 languages around the world. Here we rely on two technologies that developed in-house in the group that now mentioned. One of them is the ability to recruit large number of participants from different countries in the world. In this case, 35 languages, but we can get up to 50 or even more languages using our online operation. And the second part is validating that our participants really native speaker of this language is using a new test that we developed for language proficiency that works for all those languages. So with these two tools, we can actually run the experiments across different locations. And I show you some preliminary results. We don't have yet enough data from each group, but we kind of see the main results. So this is the results on English and Italian. And again, you see that the English color in blue is separated to two categories. Here we don't see the turquoise categories for reasons that I can explain. It's a difference in methodology. But importantly, Italian have these 2 or 3 color terms, and English have only one common color term. And when we look at this number of color terms, so Russian, Italian, and Greek, it seems to be a part of the explanatory variable. In Vietnamese, where there's less color terms, it's organizing the space, the color terms, the number of color terms organize the space. Now, when we add GPT, we're seeing that GPT is not at all aligned with human data. It reconstructs qualitatively some of the results. For example, moving from English to Italian, we see a split of the color categories. But again, GPT is much more detailed and have this turquoise category, which participants have much less in English and Italian. So basically, this suggests that the GPT is not very aligned in this domain with human data. So to summarize this part, language have effects and sensory reports in both humans and LLMs, and they are partially aligned with human color naming tasks. So just to summarize the big talk, I want to say that, and I think this talk is going to be part of it, that there is a need for a better aligning the understanding of alignment across cognitive science and neuroscience and machine learning. I think your group is doing a great starting job in talking about convergence between cognitive science and neuroscience, but this also should include the neuroscience community. And I was part of a collaborative effort, a small part of a collaborative effort led by Ilya Suchulovsky, which is recently published, trying to align, to give a framework that we can talk about all those alignments in an aligned way. So hopefully this conversation today, in the end, gonna further depth on this important part. Yeah, so thank you for all the people collaborating around me around the world, for my perceptual auditory perception group, and for the collaboration with the Griffith Lab that generate the last 2 vignettes on LLMs and larger language models. So thank you.
Okay. Genji, do you want to take the lead, or can I ask a question first then? I mean, if I see the question on the chat on the YouTube, I'll also take it. Or if anybody wants to ask question on Zoom, you can raise hand or put it on chat. So
I think you can go ahead.
Yeah. Nori, the last one was quite also interesting. I have a lot of questions, but so the last one, when you try to get the GPT representation, I wasn't super clear, but so you show the same stimuli, but just ask the question in prompt in different language?
Yes.
I see.
So we asked the question in different prompt to the same model, in this case GPT-4, but that's not the only model we can use. And it's the same prompt used for human participants. It's the same translation. We use a human translation, high quality validated professional translation across languages. And we simply ask the question in different ways. The slight question, methodological question, are you use free? It's like for people who really understand the field, are you using free text or pre-specified list? And there are all sorts of methodological questions. This explains the difference between the results I showed in the beginning and the results I showed at the end. It's like methodological question, how we collect the data. Yeah, we just run, in any case, we run the same prompt in humans and machine learning.
So then that means that the GPT is also internally actually operating slightly differently depending on the language?
That's correct. But not fully mimicking the human changes. So it qualitatively shows that the representation changed based on the language, but it still shows that it does something different. And this something different is different in all the language. It's just too much detailed. right? So it's just as if you have like a knob on complexity. You replicated the overall place that you are on complexity, but you're taking too sharp. That's kind of summarize what we're seeing.
I see.
So this means that the human species and the GPT species are very different quantitatively, but actually when you look at the data, we are seeing that it's mimics some of the internal representation in the different plots.
I see. Okay. Anybody else?
May I ask one question?
Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you for interesting talk. And can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you showed that LLM better than DNN for predicting human perceptions. And it means that our perceptual experience is always modulated by language. Is it correct understanding?
Yes, you're right in the data set we explored, right? We explored particular modalities. As a better question, whether the same things holds for more abstract modalities. And I showed you the extreme other end of it in musical rhythms, right? Where language is really, really poor describing those. So it is a question that's slightly depending on the modality. But in these modalities of auditory emotions, visual scenes and action in videos and images, yes, most of it described by semantics. So when we're performing sensory experiences, we actually transfer the image in. That's what's consistent with our data. We are translating it into semantics, and providing this semantic information provides you almost all the latent structure.
Thank you.
Okay, Tianshan.
Thank you for your talk. I'm also very interested in your experiment on how to whether you can recover your experience based on the semantic labels you give to the images. My question is basically related to what you have been talking about during the Q&A, which is, have you tried doing the same thing using musical, like actual musical pieces, and see how many dimensions within the music do you need to recover the content? Because for music, you have both the the technical bits where like what key this is on, what rhythm it is, but also you have the semantic aspect of it. It would be very interesting if you can do the same thing, what you do to the images, and try it on musical pieces.
Yeah, that's something we work on. Similarly, as I mentioned, you can do it also in the visual domain, looking, for example, at abstract art, right? And so I think it's basically a very interesting question to ask this in different modalities, and the answer could be different for different modalities. In particular, I'm very interested in like semantics of music in general, and finding ways to understand and characterize the semantics, and linking into the low-level features you compute with using deep learning algorithm or music information retrieval techniques. Yeah, so that's one of that's one of our main interests, and we're working on several projects along those lines.
Maybe before going to Masafumi's talk, I also have one last question about your first, production experiment. So in sense of from the point of view of the qualia, experience, in the production task, what do you think, or is there any kind of evidence or task that try to see whether this reproduction kind of modality emphasize more on the attention or memory or expectation or some kind of personality trait or something like that, rather than sort of pure experiential aspect?
Yeah, so I think what you're asking is like, one part of it is the production aspect versus a purely perception, like similarity or discrimination experiment. Is this a line, when you introduce the production, do add or change something substantially. So we spent a great deal of this. This was the focus of the control experiments in both papers that we publish on this topic. And it's a recurring issue that is asked every time. The bottom line is we did a lot of control experiments to try to validate that basically the lion's share, most of what we are seeing in the results are perceptual in origin. So for example, in the rhythm case, we have a control experiment with people use a different production modality. If the production modality matters a lot, the representation will be different, but they are nearly unchanged. Then we run classical categorical perceptual experiment, use discrimination and deep rhyme. There's previously sensory, and they see compatible results, and we can take a model from one experiment, move to the other model, and so on. This is also something that came up in the visual perception model, where we had a very elaborate model linking discrimination results and the reproduction result. And then we also have categorization results, so explicit naming tasks, like the color naming task, but in a musical rhythm with musicians, and then we show compatibility. So we made a lot of effort to show that there is, that the most of the origin is perceptual. Now, about whether there is something in the production that altered the experience a little bit, that was the thing that we were testing in this experiment, where I showed with different modalities, different things. And what I showed you and I mentioned is that there's an overlap between, for example, visual attention, between different tasks. Some of them perception only, some of them just eye tracking, so implicit, some of them explicit with this production. So at that level, there's high level of agreement. But of course, there's also nuanced differences. And those nuanced differences are very interesting. So first order approximation doesn't matter. Second approximations probably matter a lot in an interesting way that we need to explore.
I see. Okay, great. Genji, please.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions I want to ask, but maybe in the general discussion session. Yeah. Okay, so let me introduce Masafumi. So the next speaker is Dr. Masafumi Oizumi, who is an associate professor at the University of Tokyo. And he's also one of the principal investigators for the qualia structure project. And yeah, so Dr. Oizumi's work is at the intersection of consciousness, computation, neuroscience, and mathematics, physics. And I've been very fortunate to have worked with him for the past few years or more. And today, he will share his insights from his recent research work on unsupervised alignment of correlate structures between humans and even between humans and large language models. So let's welcome Dr. Masafumi Oizumi and everyone. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Yes. So today I'll talk about the qualia structure paradigm, which we have recently proposed. And the topic is that, structural characterization and unsupervised comparison of qualia. And today's talk is actually that today's work is mainly done by Genji and Ken Takeda in terms of data analysis. And we analyzed the experimental data of color simulated judgment, which was collected by Ariel and Nao. And Ariel is a postdoc in Nautral. So here is today's outline. So first, I'll introduce the qualia structure paradigm. And mainly, our contribution is to propose a new alignment method, unsupervised alignment method, based on Grobov-Wasserstein distance. And next, I'll apply this paradigm to color qualia structure data. And first, I'll show the alignment between color neurotypical and atypical human participants. And finally, I'll show the results of the alignment between humans and the models, neural network models, including large language models. So I'll start with this ancient philosophical question, like, do different people experience the same redness of red? So if we consider this question by only looking at just red like this, like if you are asked, can you explain your subjective feeling, quell of redness of red? You would be at loss for words. So it seems there is no way to quantify a quell only by looking at red. But there's a simple solution for that. So we can easily say that quantifies the relationship between other qualia, other experiences, like what's the similarity of red and orange. These kind of things can be quantified. So by quantifying the relationship between a quell and the other qualia, we can quantify the quell of red. Like we need to collect as many relationships as possible, like between red and green and between red and blue and so on. And then we collect as many relationships as possible, and then we construct the structures of relationships. Then we call this structure of relationship between qualia or qualia structure. So let me introduce our paradigm, qualia structure paradigm, which consists of 2 steps. First step, we collect relational judgments to estimate qualia structures for different people, different individuals. And then we compare the qualia structures across different individuals in an unsupervised manner, which I'll explain later. So first, let me introduce this first step by using our example of color qualia structures. So we collected the similarity judgments of 93 colors, which are relatively a large number of colors compared with previous studies. And then we collect the similarity judgment between all pairs of 93 colors for different participants. But each participant only give around 100 pairs of colors. The similarity judgments for 100 pair of colors. And then we collect this kind of large-scale data by using our online crowdsourcing, and the number of participants for color neurotypical is 456, and for color atypical participants we have 257 participants. And then based on this reported dissimilarity judgment of a pair of colors, we estimate the so-called embeddings of qualia. Embeddings is just a point in space, and then we express each quell as a point in some high-dimensional space, and the distance between qualia represents dissimilarity between qualia. So we fit this embedding so that this distance matches the reported dissimilarity as possible. And then by estimate, so here is an example of estimated color qualia structure, which was estimated from randomly sampled 128 participants' data. And the qualia of colors are represented as a set of points, so embeddings in a high-dimensional space. And then, as I said, that we quantify distances between each quell, and here we specifically use the Euclidean distance. And then we obtain the dissimilarity matrix between 93 colors. Then by using this qualia structure, we next compare these qualia structures across different individuals. So we want to have a measure to quantify the dissimilarity or distance between qualia structures across different individuals. So conventionally, the so-called supervised aligned method is used. So in this framework, we assume there are correspondence between qualia, like for example, redness of red, across different individuals. So there are some kind of the external labels of stimuli are given. And based on this external labels information, we try to align different structures. That's supervised alignment framework, and representative similarity analysis falls into this category. Instead, our approach uses unsupervised alignment methods. In our approach, we do not use the labels of external color stimuli. So correspondences between the qualia across individuals are basically not given, not assumed. So only internal relationships are given. And then we specifically use Gromov-Wasserstein optimal transportation for this unsupervised alignment. So why we want to do this unsupervised alignment? So the reason is that we cannot assume that the same color stimuli elicits the same corresponding conscious experiences qualia between different persons. Actually, this is a very question we want to address with this method. Like, is my red same as your red? So to address this question, we have to rely on this unsupervised alignment. Like, we want to check all the possibilities of correspondence and find the closest alignment between the structure. Like, this red may correspond to this in the other person, or maybe, this, or maybe this, or maybe around here. So by taking account of all kinds of possibilities of correspondences between qualia across individuals, we compare qualia structures. That's our motivation of using unsupervised alignment. So we use specifically Gromov-Wasserstein optimal transport. I skipped the mathematical details for the sake of time, but the Gromov-Wasserstein optimal transport is an unsupervised alignment method that try to find the alignment between two structures or 2 points, set of points, only based on the internal relationships within each structure. So here, internal structure means just a dissimilarity between qualia in our case. And then by minimizing so-called Gromov-Wasserstein distance, we find some mapping between the two qualia across different individuals. So this mapping is given by this so-called optimal transportation plan gamma. This optimal transportation plan gamma ik can be interpreted as a probability that the ith embedding in qualia structure A corresponds to the kth embedding in qualia structure B. Okay. Then after finding the optimal transportation plan, we can align the structure, qualia structure, without any labels of colors. So this is done by without color labels, and we do the unsupervised alignment based on Gromov-Wasserstein distance. And then after the alignment, we evaluate the unsupervised performance of unsupervised alignment by using the color labels, because we of course know the color labels. But this color label only used for this evaluation, like whether red corresponds to red in the other group or something like this. So just used for evaluation. Okay, so based on this method, we apply this method to the alignment between color neurotypical and the color atypical color blind participants. Okay, first let me show some kind of proof of concept of this method. So first we check the alignment between color neurotypical participants. So basically same groups. So we randomly again selected the 128 participants from the total color neurotypical participants. And this is a non-overlapped group of participants. And then we again estimate the qualia structures or dissimilarity matrices based on the reported dissimilarity of each group. And then we do the unsupervised alignment, Gromov-Wasserstein optimal transport. And then we find the mapping gamma between group 1 and group 2 for color neurotypical participants. So here, if you see some diagonal lines in this matrix, that means that same colors correspond to each other across different groups. Because that, again, that this gamma represents some probability that the, i's embedding in group 1 corresponds to the k's embedding in group 2. And colors are, sorted in the same order, arranged in the same order across, different groups. So you should see some diagonal lines if these structures are aligned. Then again, that most of the diagonal elements in gamma have high values, meaning that most color embeddings in group 1 correspond to the same color embeddings in the other group with a high probability. So this is some kind of proof of concept, but it is important to show that our proposed method work fine for this kind of sort of obvious cases. So this is the aligned embeddings. So you can see that similar colors, color embeddings are close to each other. So here we show the embeddings of group T1 and group T2, and again that as I said, same similar color embeddings are positioned to each other, so positioned close to each other. Then we did the same thing for the color atypical participants. So as you can see, even for the color atypical participants, we can see the fine alignment between different participant groups. So that's the aligned embeddings, and this is the mapping between the color atypical participants. So far, this is some kind of proof of concept that next is a sort of non-trivial result, like the alignment between the color neurotypical and the atypical participants. So here we show the similarity matrix of color neurotypical participant and the color atypical colorblind participant. Then we cannot align these two structures because you cannot see some diagonal lines in this optimal transportation plan. So this means that actually these two matrices have high correlation. Like this correlation value is 0.5 to 0.6. So it is reasonably high. However, most of the diagonal elements have low values, meaning that most colors do not correspond to the same colors. So these structures are different. But actually, if you just separately look at the embeddings of color neurotypical and the color atypical participants, you can notice that even for color blind people, that these color similarity structures are high dimensional actually, and actually similar to each other. But there is of course subtle difference, like greenish colors and reddish colors are close to each other in color atypical participants. So this structural difference is likely to prevent the unsupervised alignment between the embeddings of color neurotypical and atypical participants. So here is a sort of summary of this experiment. So here we show the alignment between typical versus atypical, or typical versus atypical, and atypical versus atypical. And as you can see that for the case of the alignment between typical and atypical participants, we cannot see a significantly high matching rate of color embeddings. So we did actually random sampling 20 times, and we plotted the results of 20 times random sampling for each test. So you can see the reasonably high alignment within the same participant group, but this is not for typical versus atypical alignment. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. So the alignment between humans and the models, including large language models. So first, let me just say my opinion about the implication of structural equivalence between humans and the neural network models. So what if the similarity structure of humans are equivalent or very similar as those of large language models? Of course, you cannot say that only based on this fact, you cannot say large language models have equivalent conscious experiences as humans. This, of course, does not hold. Like the structural equivalence is not a sufficient condition for large language models to have human-like conscious experience. However, I suppose that the converse may hold. Like large language models, if large language models have equivalent conscious experience as humans, this has to have equivalent structure as humans. So in this way, I suppose that structural equivalence may be a necessary condition for large language model to have human-like conscious experience. So I investigated, or mainly Genji, investigated the alignment between GPT-4 and humans, like Nori did. Actually, this work is, of course, inspired by Nori's work. So Genji was really excited about Nori's work, and he did this experiment by using our unsupervised alignment method. So the prompt is very similar as Nori's work. So we basically only gave the hex code for each color, and then make the GPT-4 judge the similarity based on 0 to 7 rating. Okay. Then that's the result. So we got the similarity matrix of GPT-4 for 93 colors. And as you can see, these matrices are really similar between humans, color neurotypical humans and GPT-4. And then we did the Gromov-Wasserstein optimal transport, and we can find a really accurate alignment between the humans and the GPT-4. So the color similarity structure of GPT-4 is remarkably well aligned with that of the color neurotypical participant group. So in fact, this alignment accuracy is as high as the case of the alignment between different human participant groups, as I will show later. Okay, we also checked the earlier version of GPT 3.5, and then we still have a good alignment between humans and GPT 3.5, but this alignment accuracy is worse than GPT-4. But we can see roughly diagonal lines even in this case, right? But if we use very simple color models like RGB itself, then we cannot align the structure of RGB with color neurotypical participants. So this indicates that the responses of GPT-4 or GPT 3.5 are based not only on RGB information, but also on some knowledge learned from large text corpus data. And similar thing holds for another typical color model like LAB, CLAB. So we cannot align these two structures. So here is a sort of summary of the alignment between humans and the large language models and the simple color space models. So let's look at first the result of unsupervised alignment and only this column. So this is shows the alignment between human color neurotypical participants with other models or atypical participants. So you can see very high accuracy of alignment between typical and the GPT-4, and worse accuracy for GPT 3.5, and there is almost chance level alignment accuracy between humans and their RGB and LAB. But interestingly, if you see the supervised alignment method, like we simply compute the correlation between the similarity matrix as is done in representative similarity analysis. So you can see a reasonably high correlation even for simple color models like LAB 0.71. And actually GPT 3.5 is 0.62. But you can see high unsupervised alignment accuracy even for GPT 3.5. So this means that simple correlation analysis does not accurately predict the results of unsupervised alignment. So this is a qualitative difference between unsupervised alignment method and the supervised alignment method. So as a final remark, we have recently developed a toolbox for Gromov-Wasserstein optimal transport and released this code recently. So this is a really user-friendly, easily used toolbox. So please try this toolbox if you are interested in unsupervised alignment method. So we in this paper we also applied this method to different modality data like behavioral data and neural data and the neural network models. So this is actually really widely applicable, I think. So here is a summary of today's talk. So we propose the unsupervised alignment method to quantify the degree of structural similarity between Korea structures based on Gromov-Wasserstein optimal transport. Our approach will be useful in consciousness research as it reveals the structural similarities or differences in a more detailed manner than the conventional supervised methods such as representative similarity analysis. And here is sort of the summary of the results for actual application. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I'll open the floor to the question. If you have any question, please type it in either chat or raise the hand. And also, I have some question from YouTube, but that's directed to Nori. First, does anybody have a question to Masafumi? And then after that, we'll go to general discussion.
I have a short question about the statement that can you go back to the slide showing the correlation versus the optimal alignment method?
Yes, this one.
I mean, I like the idea that these things are different, but I wonder whether you kind of provide the counter evidence for against yourself in the sense that I'm happy if you show that somehow using the unsupervised alignment, you get better alignment. You have much more degrees of freedom. Red could be a combination of orange and yellow and something like that.
Yes.
That's I'm ready to believe. But I'm a little more skeptical with respect to the question where you show the opposite, where there's something in the RSA matrix that disappears as you move to the optimal alignment. And I think that gets me a little bit worried because one thing you can think about that maybe the alignment is kind of, I mean, you don't necessarily want to align the entire space, but you get a pressure objective function to match as much as you can, right? Because otherwise, if you put somewhere different, then you don't get the pairwise distance as well. So maybe what happens that there's a few anchors that kind of confuse and bias everything and doesn't see the structures that, for example, is in the LAB structure, disappears because something in the geometry kind of push it around. And I think there's some literature, Proskut literature that kind of made a similar quantitative arguments in different aspects of domains and semantics in particularly. So I think in particular, it also interacts with hubness, which may be not a big deal in your color perception, but in the literature, hubness is mentioned of reasons where create this kind of misalignment because some kind of geometrically attract you and pulls you from being aligned and basically destroy you. So we were very worried about using this in the past, and I was wondering how do you think about it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. They're difficult to answer right now. But it's I agree actually. Like even if there is sort of the zero accuracy or just a chance level accuracy of unsupervised alignment, this may not necessarily mean that there are two structures that are completely dissimilar, of course. But I need to think about it. Actually, I cannot have a clear answer for that right now.
But Masafumi, can you show
if you
that?
Want as a suggestion, maybe look into the problem of hubness, because I think that will lead you to the right literature. I can also share a little bit.
Yeah, that would be great. Yes.
But Masafumi, do you have a data for that categorical matching without identity matching stuff?
Yes, something like this.
Maybe this also helps for the Nori.
Yeah, I don't know. This.
Can you explain what you just? Oh, I see. This is synthetic data.
Yes, this is just a synthetic data. So when we have a high correlation between the two matrices, there are very different scenarios if we apply unsupervised alignment. Like actually, the correlation between the two matrices are same as 0.9, which is very, very high. But for this case A, that two structures are completely aligned, like a 1-to-1 mapping is observed. Exact 1-to-1 mapping is observed, like a red corresponds to red, green corresponds to green, or something like this. But in this case, even if we have a high correlation between the two similarity structures, alignment is only done by just categorically, like these like block to block alignment, so to speak. Then this alignment, accuracy is very low in this case. Even for if we assess accuracy in terms of categorical way, then we have a very high accuracy. But in terms of 1-to-1 mapping, this is low accuracy of unsupervised alignment. So in this case, different thing, like this is some kind of invalid Fourier argument. Like even if the two structures are actually very, very similar, and also in terms of unsupervised alignment, of course, these structures are actually really similar, but that the different sort of Fourier, like red corresponds to green in the other way, and green corresponds to totally different things. Something like this happens in the case of C.
Yeah.
So
there are measures that can penalize you in A and B. For example, if you put distances that are more like your objective function in the alignment function, that's something even in supervised grounded version. Where you look at the distance between somehow the distances in more granularity, the analog distances, not just the similarity distances, then maybe that can lead to something. As it looks like a problem in the objective function, right? It's like you're showing the problem, right? That's very convincing. Actually, very, very helpful. Thank you for showing this. It's really.
We are very interested in
I think it shows. It doesn't necessarily speaks to the methods. It speaks to the objective function.
But Nori, can you send us the paper that you talked about? This penalizing this kind of a program. You mentioned that there are methods that penalize the situation like this.
Yeah, there's pretty kind of deep literature in the semantic alignment literature, and it's pretty nebulous. It's not like there's going to be a consensus, but like there's a consistent lines of work that I partially understand. But definitely one of the claims is similar to what I made in the literature. So basically that, you need to take care of a few things. And I think their problem is much harder because your perceptual space is good. It doesn't have hubs. But turns out that you start
I see.
hubs, and then that's very hard. But like in semantics in general, you do have hubs. It's unavoidable.
Yeah, I see. But we can use some kind of variation of Gromov-Wasserstein alignment. Like you can use so-called partial Gromov-Wasserstein optimal transport, or we can, assign the sort of mass to different mass to each point, actually. So in our case, that each point has equal mass. So sort of every point is, treated as same equality with same weight. So, but you can assign the different weights for every point, each point. That actually can, tackle the hub problem. Like if you want to assign the, high mass or the large amount of mass for hub or something like this.
I see. All right. So should we move on to different question? Is there any participants who wants to ask question to Masafumi? If not, then should we come to now the general question? I mean, from now on, you can also ask any questions. But Trin, do you want to ask question?
Sorry, I thought we can ask general questions.
Yeah, but then maybe before your question, Genji, you said that you had a question, but can I take a question from YouTube first? Okay. So there was a question probably to Nori. I've learned that ChatGPT is knowledgeable about various theories, including Ekman's, probably that means emotion, basic emotion theory. Have you conducted any tests to see whether specifying perception theory names in prompts and then asking to apply this knowledge change the output? That's our question one. And then question two is also, I wonder if introducing a made-up theory might confuse the language model's understanding.
Yeah, so in similarity, there's the question of the literature, the cognitive literature. There's the idea of that similarity may have different kinds of similarity. Depends on basically the prompt, the context in which you ask. So if I play you two voices, and I tell you focus on the emotional similarity between the voice, but you can also focus on the voice quality. And so the voice, the speaker's voice. And if you prompt in this called respect for similarity in the classical cognitive literature. So turns out that if you do that, you do get, even in humans, very different results. So the structure, if you have different respects of similarity, changes substantially. And interestingly, this is replicated when you give the prompts to the LLMs. So it is then somewhat replicated that respect to similarity given the context. So of course, that will be meaningful, but it's also meaningful for humans.
I see. Does it mean that depending on the attention to which feature of the thing that you're looking at or hearing, similarity matrix changes in humans, and also similar thing can be replicated in LME?
Yeah, so that's the point. That you can think about it's in perception. Not so much it's an overlapping concept, right? It could be like context or in this classical literature, respect of similarity. What kind of similarity you probe your attention, and maybe two images could be very similar in terms of semantic structure, but very different in terms of the colors. So from our results, you can kind of imagine that people, when they look at images, they actually respond to the content of the image rather than the color of the image. But if you ask them to do that, then they could do that, right? They can basically average the colors and behave like as if they're much less sensitive to similarity.
Right.
So that is important to understand, that there is no qualia. The qualia depends on context and task and so on. And this is like the second order interesting things that I've mentioned also in my talk.
But I would say that whether the qualia changes or response changes without changing the qualia, that's a different thing.
Yeah, and I agree about it. And it's a very good question. Right. And I think that, but our experiment uses just similarity metrics with one respect cannot tell you about it.
Right, of course. And maybe with respect to the color experiment, maybe Genji or Masafumi, do you want to mention anything about the sort of prompt dependency on the model kind of, reliance, like a RGB model or CIE lab model? If you change the prompt so that, the theory behind GPT changes, would you get a different kind of similarity response?
So actually, when I was first using the ChatGPT interface for asking like similarity judgment question, they explicitly refer to some color space model and then calculates the distance as like Euclidean distances in the color space model. And so I needed to like tell them that, oh, you shouldn't refer to any color space models. But it was very bothering. But when I was using the GPT-4 API, and then it then just like specify, oh, you only need to give us like rating from like 0 to 7. Yeah, they could follow the prompt. So I think that without, I don't know, any like constraint, the GPT might, I don't know how they are working, but like they use some knowledge or on the color space or like color similarity to give answers. But if you give
that was what we try to do with the explanation. So you ask them after the fact, okay, you gave 0.7. Can you explain that? So you could just apply. And then they mention theories and stuff that I showed, which is like basically expose that they're like they mention the color wheel and say, well, green and red in the opposite side of the color spectrum or something like that. I mean, they're not be really saying the truth, but they're using some kind of explicit knowledge.
So you asked GPT to explain their rationale as well.
That's what we did. We created a histogram or word cloud of those explanations. And you can also look at the explanation, and they're like explicitly mentioned. In for example, in pitch is non-trivial because they had to do a computation. They got 2 frequencies. They need to do the ratio. So they need to understand that the ratio is important. So it requires some kind of computational procedure. And it was not in the data set because there's no available data on that. So they must actually compute that and realize that they need to compute it. So it's pretty smart.
I see.
But I have something real interesting that I kind of didn't tell you, and that's relevant to this question.
Okay.
So octave equivalence is the speech similarity. There is a peak in octave. The data that I showed you, I labeled it under humans, but actually I was cheating a little bit. This is the label that you see for a human with a lot of musical experience. If you carefully selected participant with no musical experience, you don't see almost no peak in the octave equivalence. So the LLM not behave like a typical human, it behave like a typical musician.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, because one of our collaborators also kind of replicated like that without really knowing your results. You know, he just tested this color tone, a spiral. Is it possible to replicate? And then he found that, on average, it looks like spiral, but it's really clear that, non-musician, if you separate it, then, didn't have anything like that, but the musician had this, spiral thing. So that's, consistent with what he found as well.
We have a paper on that. I can send it in the chat that shows these effects across 3 different perceptual experiments, including similarity judgment. And we show the generated geometrical structure and their components.
Oh, I see.
In different modalities, different perceptual judgments, ways to elicit the perceptual, including similarity, which is the one that is
very good.
And I sent a paper. It's in our review.
Okay. All right. Before going to Genji's question, Jun, did you leave or do you want to ask a question?
Well, my question was actually very similar to the one from YouTube that I read Nori's one paper before, and I noticed that you didn't give specific instructions when collecting labels from humans. And I noticed that the responses, the labels, are mostly focusing on the content of the images. So I assume that's a spontaneous situation. And when you ask how much, or what kind of information you perceive from the image. So I do wonder if you change or ask participants to focus on some different types of information, like colors from the image, and you collect labels specifically about colors, and then do the same thing again. I wonder if you can still claim that words can show that can show the information people perceive from images. And I think probably now can also give more explanation here that I think if we change the instructions or change the specific modalities or specific types of information, I think the qualia will also change. Yeah.
What do you mean?
Yeah. I mean, if you ask participant to focus on the color of the image and then describe the color of image, the qualia will then be different from when you simply ask people, like, what do you see from this image?
We don't know empirically.
It's a hard to say thing, right? This is deep. I think that what we found indeed, as you predict. So, for example, we present voices, and we either focus on the emotional content, so emotional similarity, or so I think it was the way they say it, or we focus on the voice itself, the voice characteristic, or listen to the two speakers out the same voice. So the structure changes a lot, because then when you focus on people focus not on emotion, they focus on the gender of the speaker, which is one characteristic of the acoustic level. But interestingly, when we correlate this with low-level feature, in this context, we've seen much more correlation to low-level acoustic features, including F0 and everything else. So from your prediction is correct, that the degree of semantic knowledge that is so the degree that the semantic knowledge explain and the degree which low-level features does not explain will be changed in terms of different respect. The second question that relates to the question whether the qualia itself is exchanged as a really interesting question, but I think I'm not very well positioned to answer it, mainly because of, at least for me, this is a very hard to tackle empirically. But I'm very interested in literature that you guys are more embedded in kind of the consciousness literature, because it can potentially is interested in that question.
Okay.
In a sense,
thank you.
In a sense, Masafumi's formulation of this necessary and sufficient condition between the structure, similarity, and LLM, are they conscious or not? That may be also applied here as well, like attended versus unattended kind of structure. If they are already different, then that means that at least a reportable aspect or reported aspect is different. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the qualia itself is different or something like that. We need to probably think about this necessary and sufficient kind of condition logic. But
I'm even skeptical whether it's a necessary condition, in the sense that there's a lot of context that put into our experiments. For example, I run participants in small-scale societies that don't have schools, and it's very hard for them to do any of our tasks at all. Any experiment that includes two stimuli and a comparison between is highly confusing. They want more to answer. Another thing that they have trouble with, surprisingly, is forced choice. You tell them, okay, this stimulus, choose one of the four options. They choose only option 2 and 3. They don't know how to divide their answers over the 4 options. And so basically, when working in the Chimani, in the Bolivian Amazon, almost every psychophysical paradigm that doesn't work. And we found a few that kind of work, but it's not what you expected. It's not the good one. So like AXB, that's better than, pairwise similarity and more better than subjective rating. No, that's not true at all. Because when you introduce this multiple stimuli and the confusion that occurs there, so you can say, this is the Chimane, they're a small-scale society, they're like very different. But then I investigate participants from Mali and Uruguay, they're large cities, again, and not very schooled, so they don't have a lot of years of schooling, but they have troubles. Even they're very successful individuals, top-rated musicians in their cultures, very successful, but they didn't want to school because this is life for those participants. But they had trouble with the forced choice and all the psychophysical things. We could make them to do it, but it was very hard. So that suggests that actually schooling has a lot of influence on the structure of responses. So I'm even skeptical that there's a lot of context going on making those responses, not just the prompt and is it like emotion, but the whole concept of a prompt is non-trivial. So I'm skeptical that that if a LLM doesn't show that, they necessarily doesn't have, I don't think necessarily it's a sufficient condition, because I imagine they maybe just we're missing a little bit the interaction, means of interaction with them. So by asking a question, say, oh, you don't experiment, maybe they didn't understand the context, like the Uruguayan Chimane participants. If you look at the actual subject matter of our inquiry, after finding the right paradigm, you can show that they have much alignment or not. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you try one paradigm, it doesn't work. Oh shit, because maybe they didn't understand you in their cultural way.
What do you think, Masafumi? Do you have any response, comments?
Yeah, actually actually in my slide I set the necessary condition, but to be precise, that what you want to look at is internal representations, like embeddings of large language models, not just reports, so to speak, verbal reports of GPT-4. Rather, we want to directly check how the information is represented inside the network. Then, if we can see the internal representation structures are similar with humans' internal representation, which are neural representation, then I would say this is some kind of necessary condition. So if, as now mentioned, that that report involves very complex things, like not just affected by internal representation, or which are directly relevant for consciousness, but rather these internal reports can be affected by something else, or which may not be necessarily directly related to consciousness or qualia. So I want to just directly check the internal representations of models or internal representation of humans, which are neural representation, brain activity of for particular stimuli.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then Genji, you said that you had a lot of questions about Nori's talk. Now it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. And I think I should start with a question about the first part of your talk, which is about the rhythm category. And I think you talk about how people from different countries all show like a discrete rhythm categories, but it changes across cultures. And I'm wondering if you have any prediction about neural explanation about the differences. I think that low-level auditory processing should be quite similar across all humans, but probably like some higher level processing might be different, which is probably modulated by what kind of music these people listen to while they're grown up. So do you have any prediction, or maybe this region might be representative of the differences you see in the data set?
Yeah, so I think if we were to search for a brain region, this brain region should explain the similarity or not the differences, because the differences are likely to simply be, what we found is the most likely thing is that it's basically changing in exposure. So you're exposed to music, especially at early age. I haven't showed you, but its developmental trajectory is something we studied. So in a recent paper, we showed that by age of 4 or 5, they already have it. And the variability between adults and children at the age of 5 is smaller than cross-cultural variability. So it's enculturated already in early age. And with this, it's basically, I think it's related to the exposure. But what explains the similarity? Why are we seeing categorical perception? and why we see this simple integer ratios. So I don't have a neural explanation, but I have a kind of cognitive science mechanism. And I think the two things that are working very hard here are the ability of the brain and the mind to create kind of call streams of timing. So basically isochronous timing as kind of, it's not necessarily isochronous, but just kind of simple, predictable sequences of rhythm as in one mental capacity that needs to occur. The second mental capacity is the ability to group things. When you group things, you get this integer ratio, because if you run an isochronous train and you just group things, you get it. So there's some evidence in the data that I don't want to talk about right now, but that further supports it, hints that further supports it. But I think that's my high kind of in my mind, that's the most parsimonious explanation of the results, is that there is this cognitive mental representation, and they are to some degree universal. And where is it in the brain is a different question that I'm interested in doing, but that's requiring neuroscientific techniques, which is, or at least an animal model. And so this is one of the follow-up works that I'm working on it with other sets of collaborations.
I have a follow-up question about that, first part of the experiment actually. So according to your triangle representation of this, reproduction result, that would, you kind of mentioned that that's more likely to be perception qualia rather than the artifacts of the reproduction, right? And then if that's the case, then depending on the location of this, triangle, which defines each of the physical characteristic of the rhythm, right? That versus the or something like that. And then you would probably also predict that the similarity matrix, let's say you sample from that, triangle, 93 different kind of rhythm, and then you would be able to, predict the similarity matrix of the human participants. And maybe that's also really correlate with the actual similarity from the pairwise similarity experiment. I don't know whether you have such a data or not.
Yeah, so interestingly, in this particular experiment, we haven't done a similarity experiment.
You have or you don't?
No, we have not done. So it's relatively easy to do. The difficulty here is that from a similarity, so because of the categorical nature of it, the geometry here is not it's a little bit complicated to, so there is geometry, it's not very well falling into this, it's like a space, it's a categorical space. But I think this is an interesting exercise. I did try different paradigms across all the triangle in an exhaustive manner. It requires a lot of power, so it's not. So the tapping is just super efficient.
Right.
You can do it. But if you put all your power on online experiments, you could, for example, do a discrimination experiment over the triangle or preference experiments over the triangle. Things I've tried. Interestingly, there's nuance variation with respect to the priors. So if you apply the kind of a simple model and you try to predict those maps, they're to a certain extent overlap, but to a certain extent they're different. I think it's similar to color perception, where a first order approximation color space are good approximation, but then you switch tasks, you this new first, second order things that are a little bit harder to explain and difference in the task. So my prediction is not going to be like a full alignment with the similarity, because it's a little bit, but that touches those things that I thought are very interesting that came up a bunch of times, that we're seeing some similarity, but then there's subtle things about different tasks that are really, really interesting as a second order approximation. And those subtle differences points to potentially different experiences. That's my hope. I'm not sure I can show, but that it's about the different experience that you have in similarity judgment or actually experience the rhythm in reproduction. Those subtle things, second order, have effect.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe we can probably do some kind of collaboration on something like that. Similarity measurement in a large scale. On our grants, and then we can also design a task and so on. But one thing I found really interesting is that unlike color case, probably the cultural or the cultural influence or musical influence on this structure is probably clear cut, and also very there may be different kind of structure different species of structure, I guess, depend based on your triangle. So some of that, qualia structure, I'll call it, for some people may be able to align, and some may not be, and that kind of analysis can be done much more cleanly and also predictably different way. And it seems probably easier. We talked a little bit about testing the color similarity experiments on Russian population. That would be interesting, but the expected difference is around this only blue area, right? But that three or four rhythm thing, that seems to really differ in terms of shape. So that would be
it's
very
a good
interesting.
point. So just to show the data, this is like this is like as strong as you can get in cognitive science, because you have category here 2 to 1. These ones, they are like the strongest category in China. Then you go to Mali, this category is 0, nearly 0. And this category 332 is the strongest category. And then you go to Bolivia, you see these 2 categories are absent, right? However, the 111 and 112, they are present with slightly different weight, but they're present everywhere. And also in other places in the world. So you're right, there is a very striking contrasts in terms of the and they're big. So there's some shared structure, but there's also like this striking contrast. Now, I'm happy to. I think what you're proposing is trying to do alignment to different cultures, finding different clusters of this. This is possible. We did an MDS in the paper, an MDS of the just the pixel-wise distances, and got some interesting structure that is actually correlated with categories. So we found categories in an unsupervised way. You can see it in the preprint. Hopefully, all the paper is going to come up in the next month or two. But we already, because the paper is coming out, we also released all the data.
Nature Human Behavior. Congrats.
Happy to help a little bit or collaborate or if you want, you can just download it.
Great. And then going back to Genji's questions.
Okay. So I think the next question is a more technical question. I think you're maybe in the second part or third part, you're talking about using like large language model for predicting human similarity judgment. And you said that the DNA model has like lower like predictive accuracy than large language model, but if you combine both, the prediction improved. And so I was wondering what kind of model you use. Is it like just vision, like convolution neural network model, or like is it
you are muted.
I think you're muted.
Do you hear me now?
Now, yes.
Yes.
So this is a zoo of 500 models that use for the vision case. And this is a simple analysis of the number of parameters used in them, and also the performance and ImageNet. In both cases, it's mildly correlate with the human alignment. But there are exceptions of high number of parameters of high performance that are actually not very aligned. The architecture was, this was last year and a half, was whatever there exists. So there are like deep DNNs. There's DNNs with transformers in them. There are a multimodal trained model like CLIP, and which either use both information from perceptual modality and the other one, or just one of them. So just a zoo of stuff, and then in the vision case, in the video case and audio case, we have smaller zoos of models because they're harder to get a lot of models, but still a significant number. So we try to look at different architecture. And somebody mentioned these things. So these are these are basically like the old stuff, TF-IDF on the text. You just do a TF-IDF on this, or just something like so old style text analysis method, topic analysis, or something like that. And they perform amazingly despite having 0 parameters. So you just so that was something that also came up pretty nicely. That this method, they are the orange ones here. They're pretty good, and they're not as good as fitting the text to DLM. But you just take the text, 0 parameters, feeds into all text, all machine learning, you get very high, nice result. So I think that gives you an idea about the architecture and their influence. I think what was interesting for us that Clip didn't do very well. So actually, Clip, accessing both modalities, did less good than stacking the 2 modalities, which I found very interesting.
I see. I have one question from YouTube to Masafumi, actually. Since ChatGPT is fine-tuned with human feedback, is it possible that learning with an awareness of human evaluation could affect its level of consciousness? I'm curious what kind of results would one expect from the earlier versions of GPT models that were not trained with such human supervision?
Yeah, actually, that I haven't showed the follow-up results today, but actually, we also tested the CRIP, the alignment between CRIP and human neurotypical participants, and we found that we use the embedding of CRIP just for color patch stimulus, visual stimulus. And then we found that the similarity structure of CRIP embedding is very well aligned, almost similar as GPT-4 with humans. So this means that reinforcement learning or human supervision is not a reason for this high alignment accuracy for GPT-4 or GPT-3.5. And also that just by using CRIP, which is just a combination of a large language model and VIT. And then next question is that the VIT's embedding can be aligned with humans. So far, we have found that actually that the embedding of VIT cannot be aligned with human neurotypical participants, which means that only for visual information, the structures are somewhat different from humans. And using that large language models, which actually somewhat improves the alignment with humans. That's our explanation so far. So reinforcement learning doesn't matter, basically.
I see. Okay, I think that clears out the question. Jun, you wanted to ask a question or? Fine. You don't have a question? If not, then
No, it's fine. It's fine.
It's fine. All right, then Genji, do you have another question? I mean, it might be the last question, or maybe we might have a couple more space. But go ahead.
Can I ask one question to Nori? About this the rhythm thing, the experiment. So, have you ever tried the made some neural network model to emulate the cultural difference of categories for rhythms? Like if you feed some different inputs or different training data, then you may be able to simulate some kind of cultural difference for rhythm categories. I don't know. Yeah, actually, I haven't yet.
So it's a great question. So people try to perform to have a neural model and kind of low level plasticity model of neural oscillation and rhythm. I'm a bit skeptical of this kind of line of work because I don't think we have the right neural representation model for that. And to me, there is a big gap between how complex cognition and how simple those models. So I don't think there's a lot to gain from particular models. But down the road, I would want to have some kind of computational model that explains the structure of the categories, what drives cultural evolution, and so on. And so there isn't that. What I want to point is that I think that the interesting thing is not necessarily explaining how a brain can perceive this, because it can be merely a kind of digested part of the exposure, but to ask the question computationally and with the model, how that culture evolved to these states, right? Because what is a function of cultural evolution. So that's where modeling, including neural network modeling of any kinds, would be helpful. But I want to mention another challenge. There's another prerequisite of what you're saying is to have a representative corpus of human music. And then look at the correlation between the music and the perception. So a prerequisite before you have a model, you just look at those structures. So it's extremely non-trivial to take music and make from it some kind of a triangle that matches our triangle. And this is because, for example, well, of course, there's going to be integer ratios in actual musical performances, but like isochrony is much more prevalent.
Well, what is the isochrony?
Isochrony is like a pulsation. So what happens is people use attention when they process the actual physical stimuli in the environment, and they parse it, and that parses is the transformation. So unlike kind of a straight, simple Bayesian view where like the mental representation is serially mirroring the exposure in a direct way, what we're observing is a much more nuanced connection between what you expose to and how you represent it in terms of actual probabilities in your brain. And it makes sense. Like the boring part, I don't listen to the boring parts of the music. I listen to the meaningful, interesting kind of thing. So this is again back to attention and consciousness and implicit awareness, how they modulate the perceptual experience. And I think this is again complicated and important thing to study further.
But so your analysis seems to suggest that it's a music they prefer that really explains this cultural influence, right?
Yeah, so it's the music, but it's not one-to-one mapping. If you have something like a culture where they only play in this kind of rhythm, right? Then it's very, very prominent in the cultures. It's like every 30% of the music or 40% of the music. Then this color pop-ups in our experiment. Okay, that's true.
I see.
But if you want to see whether to kind of make a quantitative analysis about the prevalence of this rhythm and the prevalence in the categories, that's much more challenging.
I see.
Because what is the representative sample of what we listen? Everything, like our conversation right now is also matters.
Right,
Only
right.
music, what is music?
I see.
The music that we listen to the children and which music, it becomes a very hard cognitive science problem.
Right. But that's very interesting. But I also thought that, what Masafumi says, initially thought are really relatively easy to test. Like, once you have a baseline model of, kind of average of this rhythm triangle thing, then you further train that model, biasing with, like a rock music, and then do some kind of, modulation of the network to some extent, and then that would potentially mimic the rock music fans type structure or something, but that may not be that easy.
I think it's very nice work. There's something people can do. The limitation previously that we only have one culture, and this was Western culture. In that context, this project will fail miserably because you're basically overfitting on n equals.
Right.
Yeah. Like if I had n equals 100 like the World Color Survey and then 60 like the World Color Survey, we are currently in n equals 40 or n equals 15 countries, 40 groups, which is a big improvement if you want to try to do modeling like that. It's just that this data is just recently obtained by us by a big effort. So before that, I think this was impossible because you were overfitting. People were overfitting. I mean, there's 500 years of music theory trying to explain integer ratio of various kinds using some kind of mathematical theory. But if you have only one mathematical culture that you're studying, the only one culture that you're studying, you're going to overfit for sure.
Yeah, interesting. All right. Any other question? Genji, did you exhaust your question or fine? Oh, Fu?
Oh, I had the
Yeah.
exact same question about the modeling.
Okay.
But yeah.
But I'm not saying that is not really interesting. I think now we're in a position that in the modality of rhythm and modality as well, we want to do this interesting things, both in the level of cultural evolution, how this can possibly evolve and possibly empirically study that as well. Also in the model of the individual, how can we create a neural net model of various kinds of cognitive model? I think that's the time to do it. It's very exciting. In the domain of rhythm, now it's possible, given that we have a little bit more data. So I'm very interested in that, and I've been originally interested in, my background is in computational model of cognition, so I was trying to create those models. What I was saying about, the corpus data and your represented sampling and how you attention modulate perception, all this is like the real world problems that we need to solve in these projects. But solving those real world projects and, making progress in them, even partially, will importantly contribute to cognitive science and neuroscience and machine learning and human brain understanding. So this is very, very interesting. One thing that I do mention that I was interested is looking in animal models, because this is the end that we can. So there is a paper in Current Biology by us looking into categorical rhythm perception in birdsong. And the bottom line that there are categorical representation in birds.
Did you say bird?
Birds. Birdsong. And specifically in nightingales. So it's not on all bird species that we can find it. For example, zebrafinch is much less prominent, but apparently you can find bird species that have very, very prominent categorical representation. And using our triangle-like or kernel density estimates techniques, we could show that actually the evidence based on that show that humans and bird songs are very similar in their categorical nature. So then people picked up this analysis, and now there's two primate species where people just copied our analysis and also showed that in those primate species. So next, with collaborator Hugo Merchant, we were testing an animal model trained on categorical representation. So present them an unbiased, like full space of categorical representation, and see what kind of categories they form. And if they are similar, then we can pick their brain and kind of look at the similarity, and if the differences is also going to be interesting. But now we have access to actual neural recordings, and with a collaborator was very, very good at that.
Oh, I see.
The bottom line so far is that the behavior is very different. So actually, it's not, they're not doing what the humans. So they'd be able to do the task, which is really, really highly non-trivial, but they're not showing the same kind of representations.
I see. But just quick clarification before going to the Chuin's last question, I think. So in the case of the birds and the monkeys, you are not asking them to reproduce the rhythm, right? Because you probably won't be able to. Yeah.
I mean, people did serial reproduction with birds. My colleague Ofer Chernyakhovsky did about the actual bird structure and showed that birds can do a serial reproduction. Very nice Nature paper. Yeah, there's just two very pioneer research from around 10 years ago showing this. They also can learn it de novo, so you put an individual and they just get their own reproductions and you create some structure.
I see. Like parrots and so on, they can do it, definitely.
But bird songs like zebrafinch, the ones that I've seen in Australia for the first time in my life, but I've seen them in the lab. I saw them in the lab or some close by species. So that there's a work on that, not on the rhythm so much, but more on the song structure itself. No, it's just reproduction, and we compare it with humans with the right thing, with the corpus of human rhythm across 5 cultures that another collaborative project generated. And the point is that there are peaks, and the peaks are categoricals, and they are preserved according to temporal differences. So in your category, it's very much, according to this data analysis, it's similar to what we're seeing in humans. If I see a human and see the bird song, I wouldn't be able to say, oh, that's a human, that's a bird song. And it's also similarly in the primate species.
I see. Okay. Tring?
Yeah, I'm just curious, and maybe it's a random idea, that have you tried to use abnormal stimuli, like it's a music, but in alien voice or robotic voice, and then play that music to people, can they still get like the music, or they are, just can't get anything or so?
You mean the rhythm? The rhythm or the...
Yeah, something like that. Using abnormal stimuli.
Okay, so one thing we did, in Mali, there is a very interesting non-integer ratio rhythm in the culture. And my colleague showed it's a very prominent feature of the music. We were wondering if we can elicit it in the experiment. We found that if we play abstract rhythm right in the right tempo, not if it's not in the right tempo, if it's in the right tempo, it elicited this non-integer ratio category. That's very rare, but exists. Interestingly, if we prime them, so the musical material is actual sounds from their culture that are playing a role in this non-integer ratio rhythm, the prominence of this increased by a lot. So when you play, so when you use actual music, you can prime people for a particular interpretation, musical interpretation, which you can measure in the results. Similarly, we showed in this paper and also now in a follow-up paper that when you present spoken utterances, so people even replicate by tapping, but what they hear is a sentence, something like that. Then their reproduce results bias in some things that is similar to priors over language or prosody rather than musical rhythms. So by changing the sounds to real music or real speech or something contextual, you will change the recitation significantly, and it's also in a cultural specific way.
I see. I was about to say culturally abnormal, but I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, we went the other direction. Instead of like this abstract, we put something more concrete, and it did modulate the results. So we think that basically people are kind of turning into their default kind of the sound that is, they don't know the sound, but they turn into some kind of default. Similarly, when they ask about the prompts, they answer with some kind of general respect of similarity that they kind of infer that we're interested from the context, right? So they understand this abstract rhythm. They say, oh, this is probably like drumming music of some unknown kind, and then they do it. But if you will present them in a very strong way, in a different way, then they will, well, if you change features that don't matter, like the timbre, you play clicks instead of like, pure tones instead of clicks, that doesn't matter at all. But if it's semantically relevant and actually prime them into a certain different expectation, priors or literal representation, then it does change.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So thanks a lot. Now it's as the time flight already 7. So already lots of views and on YouTube. Thanks a lot, and thanks again for proposing this. Things.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It was really, really pleasure, and the discussion gave me a lot of ideas. So thank you.
Thanks, Nori, and thanks, Masafumi.
Thank you.
And thanks, June, for joining.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right, see you. I'll stop the YouTube now. Wait a sec.